All right, let's jump into another deep dive. This time, we're tackling the Maastricht Treaty from 1991. I know, you're thinking economics, euro, blah, 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 but hold on. We've got this excerpt here that looks at, get this, the cultural side of things.
Yeah, the whole European scene in the early 90s was wild, right? You had the Berlin Wall down, the Cold War ending.
Huge shifts.
Total upheaval. Tons of European countries were looking for a way to, solidify, become a stronger unit. And all that energy basically went into creating the Maastricht Treaty.
Wow, so like a total turning point. What do you think allowed for it all to happen right then at that specific moment?
I think after decades of being divided, everyone wanted some peace and stability. Plus, from an economic standpoint, getting closer just made sense.
Right. Strength in numbers and all that.
Yeah, and politically, there was this growing feeling of, I guess Europeanness is the best way to put it. It went beyond just individual countries. So really, the Maastricht Treaty was kind of a culmination of all these different forces all coming together at once.
Makes sense. And our source points out that this wasn't just about setting up the euro, right? There were some cultural ambitions mixed in there, too.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, yeah, the treaty did lay the groundwork for the euro, which we'll get to. But there was a real push for a shared European identity. The idea was that if countries were closer culturally, it would strengthen the bond between them.
It's like build those people-to-people connections first. Speaking of, our source actually talks about this European youth exchange program in '93.
Oh, yeah.
All these young people from across Europe got together to chat about their cultures and values. It seems like a small thing, but it really shows that shift towards a more connected Europe in action.
Totally. It takes those big, lofty goals and makes them real. It wasn't just governments and economies coming together. It was regular Europeans, too.
Okay, so how did this new Europeanness actually show up in everyday life? Did people suddenly feel less French or German and more, European?
Well, it wasn't like flipping a switch. It was gradual. But you did see things change. Universities started offering more European studies programs. Movies, books, even music started exploring this theme of European integration.
So that's where Eurodance fits in, I guess.
Yeah. Think about it. Eurodance was huge in the 90s, and it was all about individual expression, but also this desire for connection across cultures.
It's funny to think of Eurodance as like a symbol of European unity, but I imagine not everyone was thrilled about this whole more integrated Europe thing.
Oh, for sure. This treaty was a beast, super complex, and it kicked up a ton of debate. I think the biggest worry was about losing national sovereignty. Some people felt like their country was giving up too much power to this bigger European Union.
It's that classic struggle, right? National interest versus the good of the whole team.
Exactly. And our source mentions that a lot of people were skeptical, especially in countries that had really strong national identities.
Are there any specific examples of that tension that really stuck out in what you read?
Yeah, the source actually talks about how heated things got in the UK Parliament before they ratified the treaty. A lot of members were seriously concerned about what it meant for Britain and for their economy.
So it was a real nail-biter, huh?
Big time. There were some strong opinions on both sides.
Can you break those down for us a bit? What were the main points people were making, both for and against the treaty?
Well, those who were pro-treaty, they were saying that Europe had to become more tightly knit if the UK wanted to stay economically strong and safe, especially with all the changes happening globally.
So basically, working together is better in the long run.
Right. And they also felt like if all these European countries pooled their resources on some issues, it would actually make the UK more powerful on the world stage.
Instead of less powerful, which was the worry.
Yeah. Now, the folks against the treaty, they were worried it would chip away at British independence and that they'd lose control over stuff like immigration and the economy.
So they were afraid of decisions being made in Brussels that wouldn't actually benefit the UK?
That was a big one. And there was this fear that the UK's unique culture and political traditions would get, diluted or something if they were part of this larger European, almost like a super state.
Sounds like a classic debate about the trade-offs of global cooperation. It's kind of amazing to see how those arguments are still relevant today.
It's true. These are tough questions without simple answers. And the Maastricht Treaty really brought all that tension to the forefront in British politics.
So even with all that back and forth, the UK did eventually sign on, right? What kind of long-term impact did that decision have?
Well, it definitely paved the way for the UK to keep participating in all things Europe, including, eventually adopting the euro. But it also left this legacy of, I guess you could call it Euroscepticism in British politics, and that eventually led to Brexit decades later.
Wow, that's wild. One treaty from the early 90s had such a huge impact on the UK's relationship with Europe for decades to come.
It really shows how even agreements that seem kind of technical on the surface can have these massive ripple effects. It touches on politics, culture, everything. And it highlights just how complicated national identity can be in a world that's becoming increasingly interconnected.
We've talked about the goals of the treaty, the cultural shifts, the political fallout, and all the drama. But before we jump into the euro itself, I'm curious about the nitty-gritty of the economics. What were those specific criteria countries had to meet to join the Eurozone? What were the risks and rewards as people understood them at the time?
Well, the whole point of those criteria was to make sure that any country joining the Eurozone had a stable economy. Like, they had to be compatible. That was super important if they wanted the whole single currency thing to actually work and, well, not crash and burn.
So it wasn't as easy as just saying, hey, we want to use the euro too. There was actual homework involved.
Totally, yeah. There were these, I think they called them convergence criteria, inflation rates, government debt, interest rates, all that fun stuff. They didn't want any wonky economies messing things up for everyone else.
Makes sense. Can you give us like a real world example of how that would play out?
Okay, imagine a country with sky-high inflation, way higher than everyone else using the euro. If they just jumped in without dealing with that, it could have thrown everything off, prices going crazy, other countries' economies taking a hit, a real mess.
So these criteria were like guardrails, making sure everyone was playing by the same rules and that the euro stayed strong.
Exactly. It was about creating a system where everyone could integrate, but in a way that, actually worked long term.
Right.
Of course, people argued about whether the criteria were too strict or if they put too much pressure on some countries. But the goal was to make sure the Eurozone was stable and, well, prosperous, right?
Sounds like a tricky balancing act.
Yeah.
So looking back, what were some of the big potential risks and benefits of adopting a single currency? Like, what were people saying back then?
Okay, so the good stuff. Proponents were saying the euro would cut down on all those pesky transaction fees businesses had to deal with. Plus, it would make trading easier and, people could travel and do business across borders without all the hassle of exchanging money. They also thought it would give Europe more economic power globally. Like they could play in the big leagues.
Streamlining things, unifying the markets, boosting global influence. Sounds pretty good on paper. But what about the downsides? Was that whole loss of economic control thing a concern?
Oh, yeah, big time. Critics were worried that a single currency would tie countries' hands, make it harder to deal with economic problems that were unique to them. Like, what if one country went into recession? They couldn't just adjust their currency to help things out.
Right. It's like joining a team. There are perks, but you got to play by the team's rules.
Yeah.
So countries were basically trading some flexibility for stability and unity. I'm curious, how did that debate play out in public? Were there any big personalities or groups who were especially outspoken about the euro, for or against?
Oh, definitely. It was a hot topic in a lot of countries. You had economists, politicians, even celebrities chiming in with their 2 cents. Some folks were all gung-ho about integration, saying the pros outweighed the cons, while others were predicting doom and gloom if countries gave up control of their economies.
Sounds like it was a wild time to be following European politics.
Yeah.
So even with all those concerns, did any countries end up saying no thanks to the euro, even if they technically qualified?
Yep, a few actually. They had their reasons. Some were worried about losing control. Some wanted to keep managing their own money their own way.
So even with all the prep work and criteria, adopting the euro wasn't a one-size-fits-all situation.
Nope, not at all. It really came down to politics in the end. Each country had to figure out what was best for them, weighing the risks and benefits based on their own situation.
It's way more complicated than I realized. Speaking of complicated, what about the actual switch to the euro? Can you imagine waking up one day and suddenly having to use entirely new money?
I think for most people it was kind of exciting but also nerve-wracking. Like, whoa, this is historic. But also, uh-oh, what if I mess this up?
I bet there were some logistical nightmares too, right? Changing all the prices, figuring out the new coins and bills.
Oh yeah, there were definitely stories about confused shoppers, people trying to do mental math with exchange rates on the fly, and, some folks missing the old currency.
But in the end, it sounds like the transition wasn't a total disaster.
All in all, it went pretty well. The European Union and the individual countries had done a lot to get ready, and most people adapted faster than you'd think.
So we've covered the economic hurdles, the debates, the nitty-gritty of switching currencies. But I think it's important to remember that the euro wasn't just about money, right? It was this big symbol of a more unified Europe.
You're totally right. The euro represented a shared identity for Europe, this sense of unity and, well, solidarity between all these different nations. It was like a physical manifestation of this whole European project.
Yeah, and that symbolism is a big deal, especially considering Europe's past.
Absolutely. After centuries of, conflict and division, the euro was like this beacon of peace and cooperation, a promise of a brighter future.
It's almost like the euro itself became this cultural artifact, representing not just a new monetary system, but also shared values, hopes for the future.
That's a great point. The euro became something a lot of Europeans were proud of, a symbol of their shared identity and this commitment to building a future together.
It makes you wonder, did having a shared currency actually strengthen that sense of European identity? Or did it maybe highlight some of the existing tensions between national and European identities? It really makes you think, how can one type of money have such a big impact on how people see themselves? Like, what was it actually like for people living through these changes?
It's really important to remember that everyone experienced the euro, and this whole idea of Europe becoming more connected differently. It all depended on their individual situation and their point of view.
Yeah, it's easy to focus on the big picture, but these were real changes happening in the lives of millions of people.
Right. For some, the euro was a good thing. Easier travel, simpler trade, feeling like part of something bigger.
I bet it was a relief for people who traveled a lot or did business in different countries.
Oh, absolutely. And for young people growing up after the Cold War, the euro and open borders felt like, well, anything was possible.
But you mentioned different perspectives. I'm guessing not everyone was quite so enthusiastic about all this change.
Of course not. Change can be scary. For some, a more integrated Europe felt like losing their national identity or, losing control.
Were there certain groups who were more likely to push back against these changes?
Older generations, those who lived through the Cold War, they remembered a very different Europe. It makes sense that they might be a bit hesitant about this whole shared identity thing.
Right. Their experiences shaped how they saw things. Did economic factors play a role, too, in how people reacted to the euro and all the changes?
For sure. Some people did well economically, benefited from all the increased trade and integration that the euro brought, but others felt like they were getting left behind or they were worried about losing their jobs.
So even if people weren't directly impacted by the euro itself, they might have felt anxious about the economy and all the changes happening, and that could have made them skeptical of the whole European integration project.
Yeah, exactly. It's hard to separate it all out, you know. The economy, social changes, it was all happening at once. And that definitely influenced how people felt about Europe becoming more integrated.
It shows how complicated this whole period was and how hard it is to really understand what it was like for everyone. Are there any stories or moments from back then that really stand out to you as capturing these different viewpoints?
Oh, there are tons of stories, good and bad. For instance, you had small businesses that suddenly started booming because it was so much easier to trade within the Eurozone.
That must have been encouraging to see the benefits firsthand.
Definitely. But then there were also stories of people losing their jobs because companies were moving to other European countries where it was cheaper.
And that probably fueled resentment and made people question the whole point of these policies, even if they were supposed to be good for everyone in the long run.
Exactly. It just goes to show that even when you're trying to do the right thing, there can be unintended consequences. And unfortunately, it's often the most vulnerable people who feel those consequences the most.
It feels like we've only just dipped our toes into this topic. There's so much more to uncover about what it was like for people living through this transition to a more connected Europe.
Absolutely. It's a fascinating and complex period of history that deserves a lot more attention.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground today, haven't we? From the history behind the Maastricht Treaty to the rules for joining the Eurozone to how all these changes impacted people's lives. What's the biggest takeaway for you from this deep dive?
I think the biggest thing for me is that decisions that seem purely technical, like creating a new currency, can have a huge impact, positive and negative. And it reminds us that history isn't just about big events. It's also about how those events affected real people.
It's been a really eye-opening conversation. I feel like I have a much better grasp of this whole period now.
And hopefully our listeners will be inspired to learn more about this era and explore those individual stories of what it was like to live through such a transformative time.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. See you next time.